getting your diet going, you're exercising, you're still having trouble. So this is a little bit of a lesson about the endocrine system, the thyroid, and the adrenals, which are located right above your kidneys. Just want to talk about this and how this stress response may be stopping you from losing weight. So I have a little slide here talking about two important endocrine organs. We're going to really focus in on one. I'm just going to briefly talk about the other. The first one is the thyroid, and we're just going to briefly talk about that. And then the second part is your adrenal cortex, which releases the big hormone called cortisol, also known as hydrocortisone when you take a pill or a cream. And so it's essentially a similar molecule. But essentially, whenever we have a stressor, essentially the thyroid and the adrenal cortex above your kidneys release two hormones. One is thyroid. So TSH is released from the brain, and we make T4 and T3, which is we know as thyroid hormones. And then in the adrenals, we dump cortisol. Now, cortisol helps us deal with stressors, including acute stressors and chronic stressors. Now, primarily when you're dealing with an acute stressor that's like within a few seconds, you're going to dump adrenaline first, and then cortisol will react after that. So under stressful conditions, we're going to change those hormones releasing their body. So we're going to focus not on the thyroid, but on the cortisol response. So if you take a look at the brain here, we have the hypothalamus and the pituitary that actually release two hormones, cortisol releasing hormone, CRH, and thyroid releasing hormone, TRH, to actually target through the bloodstream. TRH will hit the thyroid, CRH will come down. It's released as ACTH at the pituitary, I should say, and then that ACTH is released to the adrenal glands to release cortisol. So that's essentially what we're going to be talking about and how this relates to weight loss. Okay, so the first thing to understand that is cortisol is a natural hormone that we make. This is from a study, but essentially it helps us perform. And so there's been a lot of testing on how chronic stress affects cortisol. Under immediate performance regulated stress, we want a healthy release. And you can kind of see this. So this is poor release, basically poor cortisol levels, low levels, and then a good release, which in normal people will get a peak and then we drop back down. People that are under chronic cortisol release won't release enough cortisol under chronic stress because essentially they're releasing way too much chronically. And so the body's having to adjust for that, and you become essentially less sensitive to it, and the adrenals won't release as much cortisol. We call this a burnout in integrative medicine, although Western medicine doesn't like to recognize this because they only like to recognize the extremes. Cushing's, which is excess, and Addison's, which is complete 100% burnout. They don't like to talk about anything in between. I've learned about this through an integrative doctor, and am concerned about it. So if you look at this here, performance is generally degraded if glucocorticoid, so cortisol, secretion is insufficient or hyperresponsive. So like all things in the body, if we're too low or too high, we're going to have trouble. So we want that optimal range to happen for us so that we can deal with stressors. And we're going to talk a little bit about what this has to do with weight loss. But let's take one more look here at the cortisol response here. So this is talking about chronic, whether unpredictable social stresses, stress regimens, things that you're having to deal with on a chronic daily basis. Now, stress comes from the mind, and everybody's interpretation of what a stressor is will be different. So we have to understand ourselves in order to understand what causes chronic stress. We need to listen to our body. So this is talking about the stress here that hits our body and the cortisol relationship between that stress. So here is the adrenal exhaustion. So if you're under chronic stress, you're just not going to put out much cortisol, and your performance is going to go down. Now, if we have an extreme stressor, we have two lines here, we're going to have a delayed shutoff. This chronic extreme stress, cortisol will stay high. And this is a problem. If we're staying high, we're becoming like what is called Cushing's disease. In Cushing's disease, we have hypertension, fat, and things like that. It can make it hard to lose weight. Now, we're not talking about we've moved into Cushing's, but we can have a Cushingnoid look to us if we're not getting that stress response of cortisol back down. This is a delayed shutoff problem. We need this to drop back down to baseline. Baseline is right here. So we should have that peak to help us deal with whatever we need to deal with at the time, but it should come back down to a normal level fairly quickly. We want to come over it, that cortisol response for whatever we're dealing with, and get back to a normal response. People that have chronic cortisol stress response will actually burn out, and it leads to so many hormonal imbalances, including in menstruating women. They will stop menstruating, just completely shut off other systems that are controlled by the brain. So essentially, we need to avoid adrenal exhaustion, and we need to avoid over stressing about problems. And so we're going to focus in on that excess cortisol, not the low cortisol, which will actually both can cause depression, but you'll lose hormone regulation and whatnot. So let's go to the next slide. So I want to first show here what cortisol is supposed to do in a 24-hour cycle. So this is the cortisol measured. You can measure this urine, you can measure it blood, you can measure it in the saliva. And this is the time of day. So this is 4 a.m., this would be midnight, and all the way back to midnight again here, as you can see. So we should have a peak cortisol sometime somewhere around 6 to 8 a.m. It should peak, and that helps us get going for the day. And that cortisol through the day, by the time we get to dinner, should be low so that we can go to bed. And cortisol is a stressor hormone. So if cortisol is high, we're thinking about chronic stress issues, we're going to have trouble sleeping because this cortisol is going to be high, and we're going to dysregulate our circadian rhythm and have problems. Now, in functional medicine, we actually will send people out for either to a lab or they can do it at home, collect saliva at 5 points during the day. We'll have them collected on waking. You can collect around noon, before dinner, and then before bed, and see if their cortisol release is following this nice decreasing pattern from the time they wake up to the time they go to bed. Now, if you're under stress, that cortisol pattern may change. It may flatten out. If we're under chronic stress, we don't get this drop and can cause sleeping issues. We could also have a delayed wake-up response, meaning that cortisol is not peaking here at 6 a.m. It may peak later in the day, and we can't get out of bed at an appropriate time. So that's something to consider with the cortisol. So one other important note is that previous history, our stress history, interacts with our current well-being, our current environmental demands, as this points out. So we may have to address prior history of stress. PTSD is a real thing. We may have to address that to get our cortisol to lower. May have to go to therapy, EDMR, whatever it takes to get that chronic stressor that we haven't overcome, that dragon that's following us around, to get our cortisol levels down. So it's something to consider. The other thing is, if you look here, there are both beneficial and potentially disastrous consequences of cortisol, glucocorticoid action. So it helps us rise above the problem. But if it's overdumped, we actually have more problems in the long run. We'll have hypertension, we'll have weight gain. We tend to save salt under this condition. We can get some swelling, whatnot. If we're constantly here, eventually we're going to be here, and that's burnout, depression, anxieties, and things like that come, especially depression. And what people do is they tend to eat because they get that glucose rise when they're feeling cortisol down, and that helps pick you back up. But then you get in this problem with the diet response where you have to eat to feel better because your cortisol system is so messed up from chronic and acute stressors that you may need to deal with. So I wanted to show this picture real quick. This is what somebody with Cushing's disease looks like. Cushing's disease is a disease where the cortisol is dumped constantly. And so we have an idea of what this cortisol does to the body. And this is a rare disease, but essentially you'll notice that we have the thinning of the skin, just like steroid creams. If you apply steroid creams over time, you break down your connective tissue. So you'll get these what are called striae rubra, which is red stretch marks. We'll get obesity here in the central portion, and we'll get a thinning of and loss of muscles of the arms and legs. So just like if you were to take hydrocortisone every day when you don't need it, you would gain weight, you would lose muscle. When cortisol is high for an extended period of time, we break down muscle, we wreck our metabolism. So this is from PubMed. This is signs and symptoms of Cushing's syndrome or disease. And essentially we get fatigue. Excess cortisol causes fatigue. And you can imagine that relating to weight loss, not feeling like sticking to a proper diet, not getting to the gym, feeling so depressed you can't get out of bed, using food to compensate. So we'll have increased weight, insomnia, that cortisol, we can't go to bed, we show that rhythm, and a few other things, but including hypertension and irritability, and so it does affect your person. So when it comes to weight loss, if we are doing everything we need to do and we're still having trouble, we need to address the cortisol. Now, we may not have Cushing's disease, but we could have that chronic overreaching cortisol from prior stressors that we're carrying into our everyday life today, plus the current stressors that we're under. We may need to get some help with that. So the bodybuilders have known for a long time that people like Arnold Schwarzenegger, now granted they're on testosterone and drugs that we don't normally take in real life to build muscle, but they knew that in the afternoon, they would go nap, they'd rest, and that brings down that stress response. So we may need some extra sleep. We may need to see a therapist. We may need to get rid of that PTSD through cognitive therapy and find a way to balance our lives so that we can lose weight and maintain a healthy lifestyle. Thank you.